I'm going to be the host of our forum today. Collage Live Online is a virtual series of programs by Collage Institute that seek to deepen our understanding of collage as a medium, a genre, a community, and a 21st century art movement. It is brought to you by Collage Institute. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support artists, curators, and writers who seek to study, document, and disseminate ideas that deepen our understanding of collage as a medium, a genre, a community, and a 21st century art movement. And we operate a number of initiatives meant to bring the community together, investigate critical issues, and raise collage's standing in the world. I want to express my gratitude to members of the Silver Scissors and Golden Glue Societies because these folks make a monthly donation to Collage Institute, which supports programs like Collage Live Online. And in today's program, we're going to hear from a number of artists who contributed to a new book from Collage Institute, Magic in the Modern World. And there it is. Taking a broad view of magic and drawing from multiple histories, the book proposes a way to think about magic in the 21st century, what it means to communities and how it negotiates itself in systems of power. In the book, we ask what role artists can play in nurturing and supporting magic traditions. And to that end, we think of it this way. Through our artwork, we can share stories, demystify histories, reinforce ancestral and community connections, and celebrate magical practices in ways that are safe, comfortable, and legible. We can make visible cosmologies other than those of the prevailing culture and hold space for alternative worldviews. And at various times, such work can be a profound act of resistance, an act of caring, or an act of celebration. With its history of surrealism, collage in particular lends itself to this work. I want to say a little bit about how we got here. It started in October and December of 2023 when Collage Institute invited collage artists to visit New Orleans and explore magic as a cultural idea, an ancestral tradition, a construct used by power to subjugate, and as a practice used by others to resist colonization or capitalism. The work of those artists became an exhibition that took place in June and July this year at Collage Institute Gallery. And the exhibition was the subject of a session at Collage Fest New Orleans. At Collage Institute, we believe very strongly that the book is a place for collage. Not only does the scale of collage lend itself to books, but books are able to fully document and share artists and curatorial thinking about the artwork and diffuse that thinking to a wider audience, one not restricted to the geographic limitations of an exhibition. And so today we are celebrating the launch of the book, Magic in the Modern World. I'm going to speak briefly about the curatorial premise for the project, and then we will hear from some of the artists who will speak about their contributions to the project. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat or to use the Q&A function. And if we don't answer the question as we go along, we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. All right, let's get started. So I started this journey really kind of with this idea of what is magic in the modern world? Like, what is it exactly do we mean and how do we talk about it? And, you know, in New Orleans is a magic city. We have witches, we have spell shops, we think and talk about magic. People practice root work that ties back to Africa or the Caribbean or Europe. And it's something that I think just is part of this city. But I also see this kind of dichotomy playing out where magic is both held as a sacred, special, ancestral, spiritual practice by some, and by others, it's a caricature. It's made fun of. It's seen as unserious and definitely not modern. And I was interested in the tension about what was going on there. I'm also kind of what moved me in this project was a little bit about how magic is often trivialized, shamed, and devalued by the larger culture. Meaning if somebody talks about their magic practice, so they talk about being a witch or casting a spell, that often the response is kind of, oh, that person's a little off, or they're a little eccentric, or, it's not as necessarily respected and honored. And I think some of the reason behind that is magic is kind of poorly understood. And so part of the way I impacted for the artists in the residencies was this way. I quoted Arthur C. Clarke, and Arthur C. Clarke is this science fiction writer. He wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, is probably what he's best known for. And he said, any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If I traveled back in time 1,000 years and sustained flame producing the flick of a finger, right, it would appear as magic. But today, we take cigarette lighters for granted. What is or is not magic depends on one's perspective. And so let's think about a fertility goddess. And let's say you believed in a fertility goddess and you know that putting seed in the ground, watering it, and fertilizing it will make it grow. But what you do not know is whether or not you will have a bountiful harvest. And so you perform a ritual to your goddess, where you dance around the growing plant, conjuring the blessing of the deity. And the plant thrives and the harvest is bountiful. Now, this is an act of applied cultural knowledge that could be thought of as magic, or it could be thought of as a method of weed control, right? Now, the converse is true. So we think about it, let's say you're a Christian farmer in the American Midwest, and the same scenario. You're going to plant your crops, you put the seed in the ground, you know it works, but you don't know whether or not you're going to have a bountiful harvest. So you ask Mr. Jesus to bless the crops, but you also spray some magic water on the plants a few times a year, right? Except you don't think of it as magic water. You think of this as an herbicide to keep the weeds down. It's not magic, it's science. But to someone else, that could be seen or characterized as science. And I propose that with this tension between magic and the modern world, we're often taking things that we don't understand or that are operating out of a different worldview and kind of characterize them as magic, but then also calling that less than. We're subjugating it. We're treating it as less serious or less important in a lot of ways. But what I'd like to underscore, and the way I approach this project, is that magic is a technology. Technology is just the application of human knowledge. It is an understanding of how we understand. It is what we do with how we understand the world. So ritual dancing around a plant is a form of technology. Using an herbicide is a form of technology. And they're both informed by how the person performing the act understands the world around them. And in that sense, we can think of magic as a cultural idea. And every culture divides things into magic and not magic. What is or is not magic is shaped by the culture's cosmology, the knowledge of the natural or observable world around them, and how one thinks about the unknown, right? For me, this little Android Pixel smartphone is a profoundly magical device. I have no idea how it works, but all I know is it summons all of the knowledge in the world and lets me communicate with people, right? Now, I also am a modern person, so I understand this is not witchcraft, but I experience it as witchcraft, right? Because I don't know. The unknown, it's a huge leap of faith. And I think magic works a lot in that vein. In that sense, it's working in the liminal, in the space in between. Because magic is relative to one's perspective, in this project, I did not try to rigidly define magic. What I tried to do was to ask the question, what is magic? How is it magic? How is it meaningful to the people who are engaged in it, right? Who are using that technology? And is the applied cultural knowledge functioning like magic in that particular culture, right? My thesis is that in our 21st century, that as humans, we kind of exist in two worlds. And I break it down in the book this way. One is kind of a global, homogenized, science-based, market-driven, and purportedly rational. And we call this modernity, right? It's something that it's our current dominant epistemological epoch. It's something that has been building for the last few hundred years, but we are very much part of a modern world. And that modern world is global. It's based on science. It's rational, or at least we think it is, or we think it should be most of the time, right? But then there's this other world that we live in, which is kind of local. It's idiosyncratic. It's very unique to ourselves. It's belief-based, it's desire-driven, and it's highly irrational. And I think of this as just humanity, right? It's our human selves in the sense that we believe things and don't believe things. We know something's kind of true, but we don't know why it's true, right? And that is a very different way of being in the world, and one that is often in conflict with modernity, where in the modern world, we're asked to accept and believe things science tell us when we don't have any empirical evidence of our own. So we have to take it on faith and then make sense of what we do with that knowledge. If you think about how much science-driven information we are bombarded with about what we should eat or not eat, right? And then we have to make sense of that for ourselves. We're also reconciling that with our culture, and whether we come from a culture that eats rice or a culture that eats bread. And we're making choices about our day-to-day lives based on that. And ultimately, I think we're struggling to assert a holistic sense of self. I think modernity is constructed by and ultimately imposed on the individual by systems of power. The power are economic, political, sometimes they're physical. And it's imposed on us in ways to direct the human to adapt behaviors that serve the system. And so, for example, we're all given a credit score in North America, and we all are instructed to make decisions based on whether or not our credit score will be served by that. That is a way of a system of power kind of playing out, right? But the credit score becomes almost a kind of magical thing when you detach it from any rational, logical place. And in that sense, burning a green candle might be as equally beneficial to our financial well-being as making on-time payments to our credit card, right? But in the system that we live in, the conformity is rewarded. Uniqueness is often punished unless it can be capitalized on and ultimately used by the system. And so these are some of the themes I'm unpacking in the book. I take as a premise that in that modern world, our dominant cosmology is capitalism. That's how we think humans interact with one another. Capitalism and science that organizes both the natural world, but also the social world. And I want to pause briefly and say, I'm not a Marxist. I tend to think Marxism is an extension of capitalism. And I'm also not anti-science or anti-modern. I don't think these are necessarily bad things, but rather these are things that I want to kind of look at our cultural landscape critically of. And when you get into the history, and I unpack this in the book, what we find is that our understanding of science and our dominant economic theories have evolved at the same time, right? So it's the same kind of 16th century European-based thinkers that both kind of created an understanding of science, but also created an understanding of modern money theory that we still use today. And what I also found interesting is that the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, the rise of mercantilism, and so forth, all paralleled the witch trials of Europe. That just as European society was becoming more scientific in its thinking and more capitalist in its economic organization, they were also all of a sudden deeply hostile towards magic. And so in the book, I try to unpack how science and capitalism are fundamentally linked epistemologies. And epistemology is just how we think of the world around us, right? And also ultimately what the impact of that is for magic and magic traditions. So, and in the book, I argue that modern is something that is marketed to humanity. To be a modern person is to subscribe to a particular way of thinking, to operate in the system of power as it's created. And so you could still worship your fertility goddess, but if you wanted to reap the benefits of the modern world, you needed to adapt agricultural practices that allowed you to contribute to a global marketplace, right? So that's kind of how I'm approaching magic, is a deeply individual human thing that is sometimes at odds with kind of the larger world around us. And I do tend to think of magic as being a part of folklore, a part of community, a part of family lore, These things are deeply tied to very personal histories. Um, and when we go into those identities, we can start to explore and find evidence of magic. And so if everyone listening can think of like their grandmothers and perhaps their great grandmothers and what weird stuff they might have had there on their windowsill, or um, uh, superstitions that are particular or unique to your family, chances are those are threads of magic that are still remaining. Just as uh, science has a method of explaining the unexplainable, right? Science talks about the unknown is kind of what we haven't known yet, right? And science is a process for continuing to explore that. A lot of magical traditions rely on different systems of knowledge. And those systems of knowledge may be one of faith, they may be one of understanding the world through the stories that were passed down through generations. And those stories create a cosmology and a worldview that then the action of one takes, which may be seen as magical by one person, makes absolute sense to another one. We also find that in the world we live in, um, um, we tend to infantilize magic, or we treat it as less than. And so monsters, for example, are children's tales. Fairies are not real. In fact, this is an image from the Cottingley fairies that in 1917 were debated in the UK of whether or not they were real. And Sir Arthur Doyle was one of the um, proponents, a deep believer that there were fairies, they did exist, and he was wildly ridiculed for advocating for their existence at the time. And again, he was asked to conform to a modern worldview, but ultimately resisted that. And we see that dynamic happening throughout history. And also, as we think about the persecution of magic, we have to recognize that it changes over time, that how magic was persecuted in the 1600s is different than how it was persecuted today. As part of the book, I did a deep dive on how magic was persecuted and criminalized in New Orleans. And what I found is that there are cases, well, two things. One, that magic is still illegal to practice in New Orleans. You can be fined and arrested for it. And there were cases of persecution of witches going, the latest one I found was 1963. And that's pretty relevant. But what we also find is the people being persecuted for practicing magic or fortune telling are often the people who are persecuted in society in general: women, people of color, the poor, right? So this kind of dynamic that we have is one where the system is really wielding its power and trying to keep people in line. So that's kind of how I was approaching the book and the project. And then as we invited artists in, what I wanted to understand is what role they could play in exploring this idea. Oops. And I went too far. Sorry. So the book explores kind of how the modern world uses magic, but also the kind of how anti-magic coincides with the rise of capitalism and science. Magic as a problem for, but also a tool for colonization. We look at kind of how displacement and subjugation through the destruction of language and the destruction of ritual was a way of kind of bringing people into the modern world, but also removing their magical traditions from them and their future generations. Often, and we talk about examples of new magic being seen as a means of control, getting people to abandon their ancestral traditions and accept new ones. We look also at magic as a form of resistance, particularly to contemporary displacement, that in modernity, we are not attached to the land anymore. We are mobile, we are migrant, we move around. And with that, we abandon our ancestral homelands and exist in a place of diasporic thinking. And so the book is trying to kind of look at all of these ideas, and then we look at historically how artists have made art about magic and explore some of those examples. And then we look at how contemporary artists are making art about magic. And that is organized in chapters where we look at magic as process. And I think for a lot of artists, they may have experienced the magic of making art, right? And we can kind of think of that as a glib kind of, characterization, or we can think of that as an actual sacred activity, because I think there is real magic in the processes that we engage in as artists. We can look at magic as ritual. Sometimes art made uh, uh, using magic or using a magical process is an artifact, and there's a ritual element to it. And for a lot of us, there's ritual-like behavior in terms of how we approach our own art making. There's a chapter where artists are looking on at their culture and their ancestral history. Um, there's a chapter looking at magic women and the divine feminine. Um, there's examples of magic in action, and then we end the book with an exploration of how magic is either punished or cared for. And so, with that, I want to kind of start turning it over to some of our artists, and I think I need to change my slides. Um, and our first artist we're going to hear from is Aria. Yes.
Hello.
Welcome. So Aria, I'm going to bring that slide up here. There you go. And your tell us a little bit about your artwork.
Sure. This work, so I come from a background of being a photographer primarily. And this work started probably about a year ago, actually, and then kind of came into existence during this residency in December with the Collage Institute. And so I do have particular practices that I work with. And I actually was just checking, I do have a copy of the book, and I was just checking. And so this work falls under the chapter of ritual. And these are very much made in a collaborative kind of ritual process and state of mind while I was in residency. So I brought some archival images, family photographs. You see on the right side that those two figures, and the person on the right is actually my grandmother, my mother's mother, and her sister, one of her sisters on the left. So I kind of had an idea of what I was bringing with me to work with, but then of course the magic absolutely happens in the process. And so what these final collages are that you're seeing are what I have termed as offerings. For me, it was a ritual. Again, that word is very appropriate. It was a way of creating offerings and kind of giving back and speaking to my ancestors. So those of whom are of Jewish heritage. And so these ancestors in particular were forced to leave their homeland, were forced to leave their family members, their belongings, their lives. And so what came out of my kind of my own personal practice of like listening kind of to the kind of other worlds, trying to be in communication with my grandmother and my ancestors, was this act of kind of providing things that they may have lost, not literal physical things that they may have lost, but again, these being symbolic, really, and also things that they may have never had, and kind of giving them back some of this sense of like wealth and well-being. Again, not that necessarily being physical wealth, but just this sense of moving from a place of lack to a place of abundance and health and yeah, and beauty and joy. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, it's interesting because I think of this work akin to a practice that a lot of traditions have where they do make an altar to the dead, whether at a particular time of year, they maintain that in their home. And so this artwork kind of invites us to think about, well, how do we honor and remember our ancestors? How do we give them what they might not have had? And as an artist, you can kind of create an artwork that does that, but as a person, we can create that altar in our home, and that would be an example of magic, right?
Yeah.
And
And
so,
actually, thank you. That is part of my practice. So I am a visual artist, but I also have been kind of a contemporary practitioner of kind of a particular shamanic lineage, and so altar building is definitely a part of that. And I do that in my home. It's a very personal, private practice.
and I find that too. A lot of magic is private. That we don't. A lot of us who have a magical tradition don't necessarily talk about it. Don't necessarily share it publicly. I have an altar in my home here in New Orleans, and I use it, right? But I also recognize that not everyone would understand that, and they might judge me if when they hear that or create their own narrative. And I think that's what a lot of people who've experienced magic or who have magic traditions have to wrestle with. Rodney, thank you. Uh, Now, Rodney, you have two bodies of work here. Oops, there you go.
Okay.
There's one you made at the residency, and then there was another one that you were working on for a while. So what can you tell us about this one?
My name is Rodney Boone, and this is the one that I did, I guess, nearly a year ago in New Orleans. And it is, I just initially just got attracted to, I think that's Crater Lake in Oregon, and this kid that seems to be suspended above the lake. And I really, my experience with magic has been through the act itself of creation. I was a psychologist for 40 years, and I've always been a photographer around the edges of my clinical practice. And so I've been, taking photographs. And when I retired about a year and a half ago, I immediately started doing collages. There's a backstory for that. I'm just going to kind of skip over, but basically, photo-based collages. And it was revelatory for me to engage and participate in a process that I really didn't know where it was going to go at any point. And it was very different for me than taking photographs. It was making versus taking. And that process was deeply magical and spiritual. It has been that way for me. It's where I participate in some sort of act of creation. And then I always learned so much more about my pieces much later. So this summer I came to New Orleans and participated in the exhibition at the Collage Institute, and this piece was up. And the morning before I talked about the piece, Rick and Chris let me in to actually put that television with the little rocking horse in there over a orange spot that I had just put over. This was from a Skechers ad, and I really didn't want that to be there. And my wife said, "You've got to do something about that orange spot. It looks terrible." And it was true. And so I began to kind of work with it. And it wasn't until I actually kind of placed it, and the next morning I was thinking about this, and I realized this is really an encapsulation of my career it's completely autobiographical. And this is about me, basically, in my work. The title is To Fall Up. And initially I was thinking he's falling down. And then I thought, I'm going to Google To Fall Up. Well, it's an actual thing, where out of catastrophe can come renewal. It's the silver lining in dark clouds, that kind of thing. And then I'm beginning to realize, oh my God, that's how I worked with people as a psychologist. People would only come to me when a catastrophe had occurred. And I worked with, and then that little hobby horse, it was the television in a way was how we had to go, working with screens, through screens in the pandemic, or that's like a little locked box of a memory for me when I had a hobby horse and fell off it as a kid, and my father put me back, tears going everywhere. My father put me back on top of that. And that was that piece of cultural wisdom that I used forever with anxiety disorders, people with anxiety disorders, where they had really stopped their lives trying to avoid some sort of outcome. And the therapy was to get them to be willing to risk and put themselves into a scary situation to see what would happen, basically, to find out that they could handle it and it wasn't as scary and catastrophic as they thought. So it wasn't really until months later did I really see that this was autobiographical for me. Unfortunately, these two, this was a series that I've been working on actually for a couple of years. And it was only after coming back from New Orleans that I realized that this series, which I've kind of renamed here, the Poppet series, is also deeply autobiographical. Poppets in European tradition were kind of like, I would even hate to even mention, but kind of voodoo dolls, where you could either want something good to happen when you put these things together, or something bad. You call down a hex on somebody else. And I realized that these were my wife and I have collected these ancient dolls that have their cracked faces, and they kind of have skin that exfoliates. And I just took these straight photographic portraits. And then I began to say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to start cutting them up and reassembling them. And that's what this series is. And I've got about 9 or 10 of these at this point. But my point is, I realize it's my way of dealing with, I'm 71, and dealing with the decline, decay, and my mortality. And in a way, these dolls are my sort of like, okay, I'll sacrifice these things to live just a little bit longer. So in that way, they're my personal little ritual to buy myself some time and deal with all of this emotionally. So that's it.
So it's a spell you're casting on yourself.
Yes.
Very good.
And again, it's just the mystery and the magic comes from these things get revealed bit by bit way after the art has been created. So it's a wonderful process.
Well, thank you, Rodney. We next go to Jennifer. And so Jennifer has made a very large installation that was we exhibited in the Great Hall of the Healing Center here in New Orleans. But Jennifer, this really comes out of your experience going to Scotland and participating in the collage artist residencies there. And I have a couple images, a little detail shot there, but can you unpack what this is for us?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah, so I'm Jennifer Evans in Denver, Colorado. I was a folklore major in college, and so when the call came out or went out for the residency in the fall of 2022 for Sanquhar, Scotland with Collage Institute, I was very intrigued because the theme of it was folklore and history, and we made some collages sort of based upon a book of folklore and history of Sanquhar, Scotland. So we kind of investigated the area. my emphasis during that residency was to make some collages that were all about the witches that were in these stories. And I was intrigued by the stories and the beliefs of people in the area that witches existed and what they did and how they were treated and all the rest. They weren't portrayed as women. They were portrayed as, well, as beings of some sort, and oftentimes they transform themselves into hares. What was a big part of some of the stories. And so I worked with that in my collages I made during that residency, and I called the work that I did during that time the Sisterhood of Witches, because I was, you know, interested in giving them back their power, in giving them a sisterhood, and giving them a life that was not on the edges, but was rather kind of up in front and strong. And so when I was thinking about doing the residency this past March in Sankar, I thought, well, I want to continue this Sisterhood of Witches kind of theme. And then I started really doing some research, and I guess my folklore major was coming back to me after many, many years. But I started doing some research into witches in Scotland and really got kind of maybe a little too deep into the witch trials in Scotland. And there were more than 4,000 people accused of being witches, and primarily the mid-1600s. And it was pretty brutal. It was not cute little witches dancing around, you know, looking like hares. And they weren't just doing little funny things. It was a very serious business of primarily the church deciding that if you're a witch, then you're evil and you cavort with the devil. And so I thought, well, I can't really do this cute little folklore thing anymore. It's too serious. It's too deadly. So what do? And I literally, so you talk about magic, I woke up in the middle of the night, which I don't do very often, but I woke up at like at 2 o'clock and I started saying, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I have this handmade paper. I'm going to make these sort of portraits, if you will, of all these hares. I'm going to put, I had done some research, so I found out that there were actually 80 witches, 80 people accused of being witches in the Dumfries area, which is where Sankar, Scotland is. I knew I couldn't deal with 4,000. So I thought, well, I'll do an honor, an honor to the witches of Sankar. And if you can see in that, on the detail where you can see one of them, I put that's a piece of fabric, and I listed all the people for whom they knew names, the year, so you can kind of go start at the top, the year that they were accused of being a witch, their name, whether they were female or married, unmarried, male, there were some males too, and then what their fate was. And in this one in particular, it says fate not known on these two. But there are many of them where, this other detail on the floor is actually before I actually had the whole installation put together. But each one of the hares represents a person who was accused of being a witch. And you stand away from that piece and it looks, oh, isn't that a cute little quilt of paper that, with all these little bunnies on it. And then you get closer to it. And I actually we showed this to people in Sankar, Scotland, and they were pretty kind of taken with it and impacted by it. But so it looks really cute. And then you get up close and you see these little tags on each one of them. And many of them were executed. Many of them were banished. Many of them were fate unknown. And these are real people, so I realized that there was just so much more to, and you always realize that, folklore isn't just based upon cute little stories. It is real. It is how we explain the real world. And so that's where I took this piece that I made when we were in Sankar, and it was great that I was able to be included into the magic show.
Yeah, so the full title of the piece is Memorial to the Witches of Dumfries. Yep.
Correct.
Yeah, and it was interesting researching that history because it was a very that kind of the law that allowed the persecution of witches was passed at a time when Scotland was also asserting its own identity, and also moving from Catholicism to Protestantism. And some of the persecution of witches and that law had to deal with who had the authority to kind of arrest and persecute them, and whether it was going to be the state or the church. And it came down to like this interesting distinction of whether or not the witchcraft involved like the sacrament or the Bible or elements of religion, or whether it was herbal medicine being practiced in the woods or midwifery. or that kind of magic. And
Yeah,
so
no, it was primarily taken up by the church. I mean, it was really King James, first of all, was there are lots of things that have been said about him, but he was determined to kill all the witches, all the people accused of being witches, and many of them were. And he thought they were cavorting with the devil. I mean, really the devil, and he had a huge vendetta, and that just filtered down, but primarily through the church, interestingly, which was kind of the organizing factor anyway in the government, if you will. But anybody, I mean, people were accused of being witches because their neighbor didn't like them, because they, were prettier than they were. I mean, it was, and once you're accused, there was a whole process that took place that was pretty devastating, even before you were accused, before any sentence was written down. So yeah, it was a very, very, very dark time in Scotland's history, and they're reconciling with it now, which is interesting. Actually the government, equivalent to the Prime Minister in Scotland, 2 years ago, I think, made an apology to the families that were the people who were accused of being witches. So that was quite a big deal.
In what we do in the book is we actually talk about a couple other examples of artists creating monuments to witches in Scotland in particular.
Yep.
Because across the country there is a real movement in Scotland to reconcile with this history and explore what it meant and how it played out.
Yeah,
What I found also interesting, you mentioned about like people squabbling with neighbors, or having beef with someone and then using this kind of horrible persecution as a way of getting their revenge. There were similar actions happening with the persecution of witches in New Orleans in the 19th century, where a lot of the newspaper reports talk about one neighbor having a problem with another neighbor. Or in this one case, this man who took this fortune teller got her arrested because she was essentially counseling his wife, and they were having a bad marriage, right? And so what I found interesting was how we I'm forgetting what the word is, but continue to vilify and use magic to vilify people we don't like.
Absolutely.
And so even today, it's the calling someone a witch calling a woman a witch is a pejorative. Still, it's not an honorific title, right?
Right.
It's weirdly kind of acknowledging their power, but also trying to take that power away at the same time. So we think of a lot of magic as something from the past, but what I'm hoping to do with this book is to get us thinking about how are these dynamics playing out in the world today and in our lives as we live them. So thank you, Jennifer, for that.
Yeah.
Leila Goldstein, your beautiful, beautiful collage is the cover of the book. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, thank you. Whoops. No. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello?
We can hear you, yeah.
I'm sorry. For some reason, my phone rang, and anyway, I'm Leila Goldstein, and this piece is called The Divine Hellenic. It's funny because I kind of come from okay. I'm sorry. What's going on there? Anyway, I came from this in kind of from a different perspective, in that I was a very modern person. Let's just put it that way. I lived in the modern world for many years. When I was a child, I was very interested in art, and I went to film school in college, so I was following my heart. But the head part of me was like being more practical, because my parents, they were Greek Orthodox, and they were first generation American. And, there was this ethos of, you get a job and work hard, and, everything else kind of has to take a back seat. So, I was growing up, I was always drilled into me. It was drilled into me that I had to be a good girl and, kind of follow the rules. And my dad would often ask me, are you a good girl? And I'd nod, affirmatively. And, I was happy as a child for the most part, but had to get good grades. I went to Greek school. I joined the Girl Scouts, and I met my parents' expectations. And so when I came to this residency, I was trying to figure out, well, where's the magic in any of that? Because I didn't really think about it very much. I really started my collage practice after I retired from the business world. And I was really just trying to kind of find my voice. And this was a very intriguing, the idea of magic was very intriguing to me, but very foreign to me because I really didn't connect myself with it. So when I went to New Orleans, I really learned so much about, just the deep traditions and the culture. And it was so foreign to my culture, but I started to think about how I would relate to that, or the magic in my background. So this is really the most personal piece I've ever done. And I brought a couple of images with me. The heart was one of them. And another one, oddly enough, was Saint Agnes, who you see down there. She is the patron saint of virgins. So I started to think, about my Greek background, my Greek heritage, and how everything was kind of focused on being a good girl. So the girl here is kind of the, looking up to Saint Agnes. It's the natural elements kind of envelop all of the other images. And this is really the first collage I created that summoned the magic of my own history. You've got the blue eyes. They're called matya, which are worn as a third eye charm, which is said to protect the wearer from the evil eye. So you've got the eyes, and you've got the Greek alphabet there. And the heart is really the center of it all, because collage to me is magic. And where my heart lies is in what I'm doing now, rather than the business side of what I did, which was very fulfilling, but not nearly as fulfilling as the art that I'm creating and sharing with, and seeing other artists work, because that really inspires me a lot.
Leela, what I really like about this piece, the title is The Divine Hellenic, right?
Mhm.
It's so many of us have had the experience, particularly in the Americas or North America, where we our grandparents, our great grandparents, or our ancestors, or even sometimes our parents immigrated to America, and then they had to conform to a kind of standard of whiteness that was also modern. And so they had to not speak the language. They had to not practice the traditions. They had to regard the elements of magic as superstition, right? Something from the old world, right? And we were in the new world. So that dynamic was taking place, repeatedly. And I think that also applied. We see that as in how we've treated historically in the U.S. and Canada indigenous people here, where we kind of force them to be modern, right? And we remove their language, and we had them cut their hair, and we took them off their land, and all of those things. It's a very similar pattern that we're repeating in history as modernity is asserting itself, and systems of power are trying to kind of move people into a place that is useful to them. Because as a superstitious young Greek woman, you are less valuable to the system than a modern educated professional. Is that fair to say?
Totally fair to say. That's exactly right. And it's funny because my parents were they were very kind of deep-seated in their Greek heritage for a while. And then later on, we moved to Connecticut, and it kind of faded away. But one of the things that didn't fade away was my dad passed away from Alzheimer's disease, and he really rarely spoke at the end of his life, but his last words to me were "good girl." So there are certain things that still, stayed strong in their belief system, I guess.
I find myself thinking about a lot of these things in opposition, right? Like you have to choose between embracing your ancestral identity and history, or you have to choose the modern world. And I think with this book, I'm actually trying to not argue for that. I'm trying to say we could have both. We can be complex human beings that rely on science and make good science-based decision making, but also light a candle for our ancestors and hold some traditions as valid and meaningful. And I feel like your work is kind of getting the viewers to think about that, like how do we kind of honor the tradition and also be in the world at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Our last artist, Joanna, would you tell us about your journey and piece here?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Johanna. So I have always been a collector, mostly of natural items, so rocks, shells, feathers, coral, animal bones. And I have always loved creating little altars throughout whatever space I live in. And I see collage making as somewhat of an extension of that. I feel like creating a collage is an exercise in world building, gathering these disparate elements from magazines, newspapers, found paper ephemera. I've found some of my favorite collage images just blowing down the street, and I pick it up and I use it in a collage maybe that day, maybe 5 years down the road. And just sort of orchestrating all these pieces into a cohesive composition. It's like building a little tiny universe. I really love to tell the story of my first experience, at least my first experience that I can remember of collage making, which was when I was probably about 7 years old. And I got a set of paper dolls as a gift. And I wasn't really interested in any of the dresses. They were not my style. So I ended up turning to my dad's stack of National Geographics and cutting out a design. I don't remember what it was, if it was, stars or leaves or something, but I created a dress for one of the dolls. And that, to me, I just had this moment of, this is pure magic. I think of the scissors as kind of like a conjuring wand. So for this piece, which is titled Back in Fire, I'd actually found these 2 book covers. I'd had them for many years, and they had the pink background with the fleur-de-lis. And so when I found out I was accepted into the residency, I dug through my, piles and piles of collage materials, and I found these book covers, and I was like, these are coming with me, packed them in my suitcase. And that was the substrate that I used. And the imagery is sort of a reference to a personal journey that I've taken over the past 5 years, coming to know myself as a queer disabled woman. And the little bit of text, the word one, is a reference to one of my favorite poems, Mary Oliver poem with the line, "What will you do with your one wild and precious life?" And I was thinking about that line as I created this work. And as I was traversing the city, it was my first time being in New Orleans, but it was a city I'd always wanted to visit. So that sort of felt like another magical element, coming to the city to create a piece of artwork, sort of reaching back in time to build this one piece of work that really speaks to a huge part of my experience over the pandemic years.
It's a really lovely collage, and it also, for me, speaks in some ways to this idea that we have often a distorted notion of magic. That we think of magic from Bewitched, and so what do I often say? Samantha wiggles her nose, and then Darren has donkey ears, and there's always a puff of smoke, and it's this grand gesture. But if you speak to people who practice magic, they often speak about the power of the small gesture, the intimate gesture. It is the stone that you keep in your pocket. It is the spell that you cast before you set off in your day. It is almost never a big puff of smoke and donkey ears, right? And I think part of, as we think about magic, and one thinks about magic in the modern world, it's helpful to think about it as a collection of small gestures that are acknowledging the universe for bringing that book cover into your world, or that rock, into your life, and appreciating and treasuring things as we kind of encounter them or experience them. So it's a beautiful collage. Absolutely. Thank you. So thank you for sharing, artists, thank you for sharing your work with us. It's really been wonderful journey to watch how folks have approached this topic and engaged with it. If folks have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the question and answer portion. But we are going to wrap up shortly because we are at time. The book itself features the artwork of 15 different collage artists. My hope is that this book really offers us a way to think about magic in the 21st century and what that means to communities, and how it's used to, how it negotiates itself in systems of power. But ultimately for artists, what I'm hoping this book inspires is folks to go out and make art about magic in their lives, from their families, their communities, to have the conversation, to make art and put it out there and say, let's talk about magic. Let's wonder how the history of how magic was persecuted in our communities and what that can teach us about how we're in community with one another today. Or let's kind of speak to our older relatives who are still around and try to be a conduit for that bridge of broken history that modernity has made, or that rather to repair the broken bridge of history and find those connections, because those are things that are going to teach us ways of being in the world differently. And I think, we live in a world that has a lot of problems and it can feel overwhelming at times and just soul crushing. But I also think the way we work it out in the long term is we find ways of imagining the world differently. And so as you get into magic, what you almost immediately have to kind of confront is a completely different system for thinking of the world, right? And as you do that, you start to realize, oh, there are some things that we might want to kind of incorporate or adapt into our own modern cosmology and how we think about the world and how we hold space for the liminal or the mystical or the spiritual or the irrational. And so I'm hoping this book inspires artists to kind of pick up some of that conversation and have that with their own communities that are there. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to just wrap us up a little bit. I want to thank everyone for coming. I also want to let folks know about some other things going on at Collage Institute. We have our current exhibition is called Advanced Wound Healing Techniques. If you're in New Orleans or visiting New Orleans, please, I invite you to come by the gallery. We're now open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from noon to 6 p.m. And this exhibition is part of our larger exploration of photography and collage. And in this exhibition, New Orleans artist Robbie Morgan has made collage using his family's and personal archive of vernacular photography that was destroyed in a series of fires that took place when he was 24. And now at the age 40, he's been making collage with these material as a way of processing that old wounds and trauma and find space for healing. We have two artists in residence currently, Gwen Charles and Colleen Coleman. And if you're in New Orleans this week by chance, on Thursday, they'll be hosting a workshop called Fans and Blankets, Finding Healing and Rest Through Collage, kind of building on some of the themes of the exhibit. Colleen will also be creating an installation in the New Orleans Healing Center. We have a call to artists open for this residency that's going to take place in October called Plantations. This is building on our exploration of castles that we're doing in Scotland. And so we're going to look at plantations as buildings, metaphors, and systems of power, thinking about how these spaces kind of inform our understanding of our world today. We also have an open call to artists for solo residencies here in New Orleans. We are booked up through 2024, but we are starting to kind of book and schedule solo residents to come for a week or two, spend a week or two at Collage Institute Gallery, make art in the studio, and explore and ultimately develop their practice. And then if you are interested in the Castles project, but not able to come to New Orleans for the plantation residency, very shortly we will open up a call to artists for a virtual Castles project, again, exploring castles as buildings, metaphors, and systems of power. And in this virtual residency, what we really want to do is start tackling that space that castles hold in our imagination. So thinking about everything from Minecraft to Disney World, to this fantasy that we all have of being the princess of the castle or the prince, and all of the stories of Cinderella and that we're told throughout our lives, and what they mean ultimately to how we think about power, wealth, and story today in the world we live in. So that's just a little glimpse of some upcoming programs. Please check our website, collageinstitute.org, for more information. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And I hope you can get a copy of the book and have a wonderful day. Thank you.